Ah, there you are, my dear friend. Come in out of the cold and warm yourself by the fire. I was just perusing the volumes on the dusty old shelves of this library for something to read before retiring. Who do we have? Blackwood, James, Lovecraft, Poe. Quite the collection. Would you care to hear something? You would? Splendid. Now, let me see. Ah, here we are. I believe I have the very thing. Opening the Door by Arthur Machen. The newspaper reporter, from the nature of the case, has generally to deal with the commonplaces of life. He does his best to find something singular and arresting in the spectacle of the day's doings, but in spite of himself he is generally forced to confess that whatever there may be beneath the surface itself is dull enough. I must allow, however, that during my 10 years or so in Fleet Street I came across some tracks that were not devoid of oddity. There was that business of Campo Tosto, for example. That never got into the papers. Campo Tosto, I must explain, was a Belgian, settled for many years in England, who had left all his property to the man who looked after him. My news editor was struck by something odd in the brief story that appeared in the morning paper, and sent me down to make inquiries. I left the train at Reigate, and there I found that Mr. Campo Tosto had lived at a place called Burnt Green, which is a translation of his name into English, and that he shot at trespassers with a bow and arrows. I was driven to his house, and saw through a glass door some of the property which he had bequeathed to his servant. 15th-century triptychs, dim and rich and golden, carved statues of the saints, great spiked altar candlesticks, storied censers in tarnished silver, and much more of old church treasure. The legatee, whose name was Turk, would not let me enter, but as a treat he took my newspaper from my pocket and read it upside down with great accuracy and facility. I wrote this very queer story, but Fleet Street would not suffer it. I believe it struck them as too strange a thing for their sober columns. And then there was the affair of the JHVS syndicate, which dealt with a Kabbalistic cipher and the phenomenon called in the Old Testament the glory of the Lord, and the discovery of certain objects buried under the site of the temple at Jerusalem. That story was left half told, and I never heard the ending of it. And I never understood the affair of the hoard of coins that a storm disclosed on the Suffolk coast near Aldeburgh. From the talk of the longshoremen, who were on the lookout amongst the dunes, it appeared that a great wave came in and washed away a slice of the sand cliff just beneath them. They saw glittering objects as the sea washed back, and retrieved what they could. I viewed the treasure. It was a collection of coins, the earliest of the 12th century, the latest pennies, 3 or 4 of them of Edward VII, and a bronze medal of Charles Spurgeon. There are, of course, explanations of the puzzle, but there are difficulties in the way of accepting any one of them. It is very clear, for example, that the hoard was not gathered by a collector of coins. Neither the 20th century pennies nor the medal of the great Baptist preacher would appeal to a numismatologist. But perhaps the queerest story to which my newspaper connections introduced me was the affair of the Reverend Secretan Jones, the Canonbury clergyman, as the headlines called him. To begin with, it was a matter of sudden disappearance. I believe people of all sorts disappear by dozens in the course of every year, and nobody hears of them or their vanishings. Perhaps they turn up again, or perhaps they don't. Anyhow, they never get so much as a line in the papers, and there is an end of it. Take, for example, that unknown man in the burning car who cost the amorous commercial traveller his life. In a certain sense, we all heard of him, but he must have disappeared from somewhere in space, and nobody knew that he had gone from his world. So it is often. But now and then there is some circumstance that draws attention to the fact that A or B was in his place on Monday and missing from it on Tuesday and Wednesday. And then inquiries are made, and usually the lost man is found, alive or dead, and the explanation is often simple enough. But as to the case of Secretan Jones. This gentleman, a cleric, as I have said, but seldom it appeared exercising his sacred office, lived retired in a misty 1830-40 square in the recesses of Canonbury. He was understood to be engaged in some kind of scholarly research, was a well-known figure in the reading room at the British Museum, and looked anything between 50 and 60. It seems probable that if he had been content with that achievement, he might have disappeared as often as he pleased, and nobody would have troubled. But one night, as he sat late over his books in the stillness of that retired quarter, a motor lorry passed along a road not far from Tollet Square, breaking the silence with a heavy rumble, and causing a tremor of the ground that penetrated into Secretan Jones's study. A teacup and saucer on a side table trembled slightly, and Secretan Jones's attention was taken from his authorities and notebooks. This was in February or March of 1907, and the motor industry was still in its early stages. If you preferred a horse bus, there were plenty left in the streets. Motor coaches were non-existent, hansom cabs still jogged and jingled on their cheerful way, and there were very few heavy motor vans in use. But to Secretan Jones, disturbed by the rattle of his cup and saucer, a vision of the future, highly coloured, was vouchsafed, and he began to write to the papers. He saw the London streets almost as we know them today, streets where a horse vehicle would be almost a matter to show one's children for them to remember in their old age, streets in which a great procession of huge omnibuses carrying 50, 70, 100 people was continually passing, streets in which vans and trailers loaded far beyond the capacity of any manageable team of horses would make the ground tremble without ceasing. The retired scholar, with a happy activity which does sometimes, oddly enough, distinguish the fish out of water, went on and spared nothing. Newton saw the apple fall and built up a mathematical universe. Jones heard the teacup rattle and laid the universe of London in ruins. He pointed out that neither the roadways nor the houses beside them were constructed to withstand the weight and vibration of the coming traffic. He crumbled all the shops in Oxford Street and Piccadilly into dust. He cracked the dome of St. Paul's, brought down Westminster Abbey, reduced the law courts to a fine powder. What was left was dealt with by fire, flood, and pestilence. The prophetic Jones demonstrated that the roads must collapse, involving the various services beneath them. Here the water mains and the main drainage would flood the streets. There huge volumes of gas would escape, and electric wires fuse. The earth would be rent with explosions, and the myriad streets of London would go up in a great flame of fire. Nobody really believed that it would happen, but it made good reading, and Secretan Jones gave interviews, started discussions, and enjoyed himself thoroughly. Thus he became the Canonbury clergyman. Canonbury clergyman says that catastrophe is inevitable. Doom of London pronounced by Canonbury clergyman. Canonbury clergyman's forecast. London a carnival of flood, fire, and earthquake. That sort of thing. And thus Secretan Jones, though his main interests were liturgical, was able to secure a few newspaper paragraphs when he disappeared, rather more than a year after his great campaign in the press, which was not quite forgotten, but not very clearly remembered. A few paragraphs, I said, and stowed away most of them in out-of-the-way corners of the papers. It seemed that Mrs. Sedger, the woman who shared with her husband the business of looking after Secretan Jones, brought in tea on a tray to his study at 4 o'clock as usual, and came again as usual to take it away at 5. And a good deal to her astonishment, the study was empty. She concluded that her master had gone out for a stroll, though he never went out for strolls between tea and dinner. He didn't come back for dinner, and Sedger, inspecting the hall, pointed out that the master's hats and coats and sticks and umbrellas were all on their pegs and in their places. The Sedgers conjectured this, that, and the other, waited a week, and then went to the police, and the story came out and perturbed a few learned friends and correspondents. Prebendary Lincoln, author of the Roman Canon in the 3rd century, Dr. Brightwell, wise on the rite of Malabar, and Stokes, the Mozarabic man. The rest of the populace did not take very much interest in the affair, and when, at the end of 6 weeks, there was a line or two stating that the Reverend Secretan Jones, whose disappearance at the beginning of last month from his house in Tollet Square, Canonbury, caused some anxiety to his friends, returned yesterday, there was neither enthusiasm nor curiosity. The last line of the paragraph said that the incident was supposed to be the result of a misunderstanding, and nobody even asked what that statement meant. And there would have been the end of it, if Sedger had not gossiped to the circle in the private bar of the King of Prussia. Some mysterious and unofficial person in touch with this circle insinuated himself into the presence of my news editor and told him Sedger's tale. Mrs. Sedger, a careful woman, had kept all the rooms tidy and well dusted. On the Tuesday afternoon she had opened the study door and saw, to her amazement and delight, her master sitting at his table with a great book open beside him and a pencil in his hand. She exclaimed, "Oh, sir, I am glad to see you back again." "Back again?" said the clergyman. "What do you mean? I think I should like some more tea." "I don't know in the least what it's all about," said the news editor, "but you might go and see Secretary Jones and have a chat with him. There may be a story in it." There was a story in it, but not for my paper, or any other paper. I got into the house in Tollet Square on some unhandsome pretext connected with Secretary Jones's traffic scare the year before. He looked at me in a dim, abstracted way at first. The great book of his servant's story, and other books, and many black quarto notebooks were about him. But my introduction of the proposed design for a mammoth carrier clarified him, and he began to talk eagerly, and, as it seemed to me, lucidly, of the grave menace of the new mechanical transport. "But what's the use in talking?" he ended. "I try to wake people up to the certain dangers ahead. I seem to succeed for a few weeks, and then they forgot all about it. You would say that the great majority are like dreamers, like sleepwalkers. Yes, like men walking in a dream, shutting out all the actualities, all the facts of life. They know they are, in fact, walking on the edge of a precipice, and yet they are able to believe, it seems, that the precipice is a garden path, and they behave as if it were a garden path, as safe as that path you see down there going to the door at the bottom of my garden." The study was at the back of the house, and looked on the long garden, heavily overgrown with shrubs run wild, mingling with one another, some of them flowering richly, and altogether and happily obscuring and confounding the rigid grey walls that doubtless separated each garden from its neighbours. Above the tall shrubs, taller elms and planes and ash trees grew, unlopped and handsomely neglected, and under this deep concealment of green boughs the path went down to a green door, just visible under a cloud of white roses. "As safe as that path you see there," Secretary Jones repeated, and looking at him I thought his expression changed a little, very slightly indeed, but to a certain questioning, one might say to a meditative doubt. He suggested to me a man engaged in an argument, who puts his case strongly, decisively, and then hesitates for the fraction of a second as a point occurs to him of which he had never thought before, a point as yet unweighed, unestimated, dimly present, but more as a shadow than a shape. The newspaper reporter needs the gestures of the serpent as well as its wisdom. I forget how I glided from the safe topic of the traffic peril to the dubious territory which I had been sent to explore. At all events, my contortions were the most graceful that I could devise, but they were altogether vain. Secretary Jones's kind, lean, clean-shaven face took on an expression of distress. He looked at me as one in perplexity. He seemed to search his mind, not for the answer that he should give me, but rather for some answer due to himself. "I am extremely sorry that I cannot give you the information you want," he said after a considerable pause. "But I really can't go any farther into the matter. In fact, it is quite out of the question to do so. You must tell your editor, or sub-editor, which is it, that the whole business is due to a misunderstanding, a misconception which I am not at liberty to explain. But I am really sorry that you have come all this way for nothing." There was real apology and regret, not only in his words, but in his tones and in his aspect. I could not clutch my hat and get on my way with a short word in the character of a disappointed and somewhat disgusted emissary, so we fell on general talk, and it came out that we both came from the Welsh borderland, and had long ago walked over the same hills and drunk of the same wells. Indeed, I believe we proved cousinship in the 7th degree or so. And tea came in, and before long Secretary Jones was deep in liturgical problems, of which I knew just enough to play the listener's part. Indeed, when I told him that the Hwyl, or chanted eloquence of the Welsh Methodists, was in fact the preface tone of the Roman Missal, he overflowed with grateful interest, and made a note in one of his books, and said the point was most curious and important. It was a pleasant evening, and we strolled through the French windows into the green-shadowed, blossoming garden, and went on with our talk till it was time, and high time, for me to go. I had taken up my hat as we left the study, and as we stood by the green door in the wall at the end of the garden, I suggested that I might use it. "I'm so sorry," said Secretary Jones, looking, I thought, a little worried, "but I'm afraid it's jammed, or something of that kind. It has always been an awkward door, and I hardly ever use it." So we went through the house, and on the doorstep he pressed me to come again, and was so cordial that I agreed to his suggestion of the Saturday Sennight. And so, at last, I got an answer to the question with which my newspaper had originally entrusted me. But an answer by no means for newspaper use. The tale, or the experience, or the impression, or whatever it may be called, was delivered to me by very slow degrees, with hesitations, and in a manner of tentative suggestion that often reminded me of our first talk together. It was as if Jones were again and again questioning himself as to the manner of his utterances, as if he doubted whether they should not rather be treated as dreams, and dismissed as trifles without consequence. He said once to me, "People do tell their dreams, I know, but isn't it usually felt that they are telling nothing? That's what I am afraid of." I told him that I thought we might throw a great deal of light on very dark places if more dreams were told. "But there," I said, "is the difficulty. I doubt whether the dreams that I am thinking of can be told. There are dreams that are perfectly lucid from beginning to end, and also perfectly insignificant. There are others which are blurred by a failure of memory, perhaps only on one point. You dream of a dead man as if he were alive. Then there are dreams which are prophetic. There seems on the whole no doubt of that. Then you may have sheer clotted nonsense. I once chased Julius Caesar all over London to get his recipe for curried eggs. But besides these, there is a certain dream of another order, utter lucidity up to the moment of waking, and then perceived to be beyond the power of words to express. It is neither sense nor nonsense. It has, perhaps, a notation of its own, but, well, you can't play Euclid on the violin." Secretary Jones shook his head. "I am afraid my experiences are rather like that," he said. It was clear indeed that he found great difficulty in finding a verbal formula which should convey some hint of his adventures. But that was later. To start with, things were fairly easy, but characteristically enough, he began his story before I realized that the story had begun. I had been talking of the queer tricks a man's memory sometimes plays him. I was saying that a few days before I was suddenly interrupted in some work I was doing. It was necessary that I should clear my desk in a hurry. I shuffled a lot of loose papers together and put them away, and awaited my caller with a fresh writing pad before me. The man came. I attended to the business with which he was concerned, and went back to my former affair when he had gone. But I could not find the sheaf of papers. I thought I had put them in a drawer. They were not in the drawer. They were not in any drawer, or in the blotting book, or in any place where one might reasonably expect to find them. They were found next morning by the servant who dusted the room, stuffed hard down into the crevice between the seat and the back of an armchair, and carefully hidden under a cushion. And, I finished, I hadn't the faintest recollection of doing it. My mind was blank on the matter. "Yes," said Secretary Jones. "I suppose we all suffer from that sort of thing at times. About a year ago I had a very odd experience of the same kind. It troubled me a good deal at the time. It was soon after I had taken up that question of the new traffic and its certain results. As you may have gathered, I have been absorbed for most of my life in my own special studies, which are remote enough from the activities and interests of the day. It hasn't been at all my way to write to the papers to say there are too many dogs in London, or to denounce street musicians. But I must say that the extraordinary dangers of using our present road system for a traffic for which it was not designed did impress themselves very deeply upon me, and I dare say I allowed myself to be over-interested and over-excited. There is a great deal to be said for the apostolic maxim, "Study to be quiet and to mind your own business." I am afraid I got the whole thing on the brain, and neglected my own business, which at that particular time, if I remember, was the investigation of a very curious question, the validity or non-validity of the consecration formula of the Grand Saint Graal. Car chou est l'isonc di ma nouvelle loi, li meilleur méisme. Instead of attending to my proper work, I allowed myself to be drawn into the discussion I had started, and for a week or two I thought of very little else. Even when I was looking up authorities at the British Museum, I couldn't get the rumble of the motor van out of my head. So, you see, I allowed myself to get harried and worried and distracted, and I put down what followed to all the bother and excitement I was going through. The other day, when you had to leave your work in the middle and start on something else, I dare say you felt annoyed and put out, and shoved those papers of yours away without really thinking of what you were doing, and I suppose something of the same kind happened to me, though it was still queerer, I think. He paused and seemed to meditate doubtfully, and then broke out with an apologetic laugh, and "It really sounds quite crazy." And then, "I forgot where I lived." Loss of memory, in fact, through overwork and nervous excitement? Yes, but not quite in the usual way. I was quite clear about my name and my identity, and I knew my address perfectly well, 39 Tullet Square, Canonbury. But you said you forgot where you lived. I know, but there's the difficulty of expression we were talking about the other day. I am looking for the notation, as you called it. But it was like this. I had been working till the morning in the reading room with the motor danger at the back of my mind, and as I left the museum, feeling a sort of heaviness and confusion, I made up my mind to walk home. I thought the air might freshen me a little. I set out at a good pace. I knew every foot of the way, as I had often done the walk before, and I went ahead mechanically, with my mind wrapped up in a very important matter relating to my proper studies. As a matter of fact, I had found in a most unexpected quarter a statement that threw an entirely new light on the rite of the Celtic Church, and I felt that I might be on the verge of an important discovery. I was lost in a maze of conjectures, and when I looked up, I found myself standing on the pavement by the Angel Islington, totally unaware of where I was to go next. Yes, quite so. I knew the Angel when I saw it, and I knew I lived in Tullet Square, but the relation between the two had entirely vanished from my consciousness. For me, there were no longer any points of the compass. There was no such thing as direction, neither north or south, nor left nor right, an extraordinary sensation, which I don't feel I have made plain to you at all. I was a good deal disturbed, and felt that I must move somewhere, so I set off, and found myself at King's Cross railway station. Then I did the only thing there was to be done, took a hansom and got home, feeling shaky enough. I gathered that this was the first incident of significance in a series of odd experiences that befell this learned and amiable clergyman. His memory became thoroughly unreliable, or so he thought at first. He began to miss important papers from his table in the study. A series of notes on 3 sheets lettered A, B, and C were placed by him on the table under a paperweight one night, just before he went up to bed. They were missing when he went into his study the next morning. He was certain that he had put them in that particular place, under the bulbous glass weight with the pink roses embedded in its depths. But they were not there. Then Mrs. Sedger knocked at the door and entered with the papers in her hand. She said she had found them between the bed and the mattress in the master's bedroom, and thought they might be wanted. Secretan Jones could not make it out at all. He supposed he must have put the papers where they were found, and then forgotten all about it, and he was uneasy, feeling afraid that he was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Then there were difficulties about his books, as to which he was very precise, every book having its own place. One morning he wanted to consult the Missale de Arbuthnot, a big red quarto which lived at the end of a bottom shelf near the window. It was not there. The unfortunate man went up to his bedroom, and felt the bed all over, and looked under his shirts in the chest of drawers, and searched all the room in vain. However, determined to get what he wanted, he went to the reading-room, verified his reference, and returned to Canonbury. And there was the red quarto in its place. Now here it seemed certain there was no room for loss of memory, and Secretan Jones began to suspect his servants of playing tricks with his possessions, and tried to find a reason for their imbecility or villainy, he did not know what to call it. But it would not do at all. Papers and books disappeared and reappeared, or now and then vanished without return. One afternoon, struggling, as he told me, against a growing sense of confusion and bewilderment, he had with considerable difficulty filled 2 quarto sheets of ruled paper with a number of extracts necessary to the subject he had in hand. When this was done, he felt his bewilderment thickening like a cloud about him. It was, physically and mentally, as if the objects in the room became indistinct, were presented in a shimmering mist or darkness. He felt afraid, and rose and went out into the garden. The 2 sheets of paper he had left on his table were lying on the path by the garden door. I remember he stopped dead at this point. To tell the truth, I was thinking that all these instances were rather matter for the ear of a mental specialist than for my hearing. There was evidence enough of a bad nervous breakdown, and, it seemed to me, of delusions. I wondered whether it was my duty to advise the man to go to the best doctor he knew, and without delay. Then Secretan Jones began again. "I won't tell you any more of these absurdities. I know they are drivel, pantomime tricks and traps, children's conjuring, contemptible, all of it. But it made me afraid. I felt like a man walking in the dark, beset with uncertain sounds, and faint echoes of his footsteps that seem to come from a vast depth, till he begins to fear that he is treading by the edge of some awful precipice. There was something unknown about me, and I was holding on hard to what I knew, and wondering whether I should be sustained. One afternoon I was in a very miserable and distracted state. I could not attend to my work. I went out into the garden, and walked up and down trying to calm myself. I opened the garden door, and looked into the narrow passage which runs at the end of all the gardens on this side of the square. There was nobody there, except 3 children playing some game or other. They were queer, stunted little creatures, and I turned back into the garden and walked into the study. I had just sat down and had turned to my work, hoping to find relief in it, when Mrs. Sedger, my servant, came into the room, and cried out in an excited sort of way that she was glad to see me back again. I made up some story. I don't know whether she believes it. I suppose she thinks I have been mixed up in something disreputable. And what had happened? I haven't the remotest notion. We sat looking at each other for some time. "I suppose what happened was just this," I said at last. "Your nervous system had been in a very bad way for some time. It broke down utterly. You lost your memory, your sense of identity, everything. You may have spent the 6 weeks in addressing envelopes in the City Road." He turned to one of the books on the table and opened it. Between the leaves there were the dimmed red and white petals of some flower that looked like an anemone. "I picked this flower," he said, "as I was walking down the path that afternoon. It was the first of its kind to be in bloom, very early. It was still in my hand when I walked back into this room 6 weeks later, as everybody declares, but it was quite fresh." There was nothing to be said. I kept silent for 5 minutes, I suppose, before I asked him whether his mind was an utter blank as to the 6 weeks during which no known person had set eyes on him, whether he had no sort of recollection, however vague. "At first, nothing at all. I could not believe that more than a few seconds came between my opening the garden door and shutting it. Then, in a day or 2, there was a vague impression that I had been somewhere where everything was absolutely right. I can't say more than that. No fairyland joys or bowers of bliss or anything of that kind. no sense of anything strange or unaccustomed, but there was no care there at all. Est enim magnum chaos. But that means, for there is a great void, or a great gulf. We never spoke of the matter again. 2 months later, he told me that his nerves had been troubling him, and that he was going to spend a month or 6 weeks at a farm near Llanthony in the Black Mountains, a few miles from his old home. In 3 weeks I got a letter addressed in Secretary Jones's hand. Inside was a slip of paper on which he had written the words, Est enim magnum chaos. The day on which the letter was posted, he had gone out in wild autumn weather late one afternoon, and had never come back. No trace of him has ever been found.